The room was supposed to be calm, orderly, another scripted political forum where words were rehearsed, tempers were managed, and the cameras quietly captured history. But then it happened. Kamala Harris's voice cut through the chamber like a blade, sharp, unrelenting, impossible to ignore. Her tone wasn't measured, it wasn't careful, it was explosive. She leaned forward, eyes narrowing, as if every ounce of frustration, pride, and defiance had been bottled up until this very instant. "Enough," she snapped, her words echoing across the hall, drowning out the murmurs of the crowd. A vice president losing composure in front of the nation. The silence that followed wasn't polite, it was stunned. Eyes darted, phones raised, and even the moderator seemed frozen. Did Kamala Harris just lose it on stage? The cameras zoomed closer, catching every flicker of her expression. You could almost hear the collective gasp ripple across the audience and beyond that, across millions watching at home. This wasn't policy being debated. This wasn't the sterile language of politics. This was something raw, something unfiltered. A crack in the armor of one of the most powerful women in America. And across from her sat Jasmine Crockett. Still, calm. Her hands resting lightly, her expression unreadable. Not a smirk. Not a flinch. Just quiet composure in the face of a storm. The contrast was electrifying. On one side, the eruption of anger, the demand for control. On the other, the silence of a woman who knew the power of waiting. Every second felt longer than the last. The cameras cut between them, Harris, visibly rattled, searching for authority and volume. Crockett, unshaken, measuring the perfect moment. This wasn't just an exchange. This was a collision of worlds, establishment versus challenger, rage versus dignity. And the entire nation sat at the edge of their seats, waiting to see how it would unfold. But no one in that room, and no one watching online, could have predicted what came next. Because when Jasmine Crockett finally opened her mouth, her response didn't just silence the vice president. It broke the internet. To understand why this clash mattered, you have to step back. This wasn't a random spat, some forgettable headline destined to fade with tomorrow's news cycle. No, the moment Vice President Kamala Harris raised her voice at Jasmine Crockett was the culmination of deeper fault lines running straight through American politics. The stage was supposed to showcase unity. It was billed as a conversation, a chance for leading figures to discuss the pressing issues shaping the nation. But like so many political stages before it, unity was only the headline. Beneath the surface, it was an arena. The lights, the cameras, the stakes, they weren't about polite dialogue. They were about dominance. Who would walk away commanding the narrative, and who would be painted as weak, unfit, or forgettable? On one side stood Kamala Harris, the sitting vice president. The embodiment of establishment power, polished in image, scripted in language, and backed by the weight of the White House itself. She didn't walk onto that stage as just another speaker. She walked on as the symbol of entrenched authority, a living reminder of how hard it is to challenge the hierarchy of American politics. And on the other side, Jasmine Crockett. A rising voice, less polished perhaps, but grounded in something the establishment often struggles to manufacture: authenticity. She was not the vice president. She didn't carry decades of institutional clout. But what she did carry was the fire of a grassroots fighter, a woman who built her reputation on grit, honesty, and unshakable conviction. To her supporters, she was proof that truth and dignity still had a place in politics. The air was already tense before the eruption. Every person in the audience knew they weren't just watching a conversation between two women. They were watching a collision between two Americas, the old guard with its scripted lines and careful masks, versus the new generation, unafraid to speak plainly, unafraid to confront power even when the cost was high. So when Harris snapped, when her voice broke through with raw anger, it wasn't just Kamala Harris losing her cool. It was the establishment flinching under pressure. It was a system accustomed to obedience suddenly confronted by a challenger who refused to bow. And here's where the stakes rose higher than anyone realized in that instant. Because Crockett's calm wasn't passive. It wasn't silence born of hesitation. It was a calculated pause, the kind of silence that speaks louder than any shouted words. Viewers didn't yet know it, but Crockett was about to deliver a response that would redefine not just the debate, but the entire narrative around power, respect, and dignity in American politics. Think about it. In a culture obsessed with viral clips, who really wins a debate? The one who shouts the loudest, or the one whose words are replayed, remixed, and quoted by millions the next day? Crockett understood this better than anyone. Her reply wasn't crafted for the moderators. It wasn't meant for the room alone. It was aimed at the millions of ordinary Americans scrolling through their feeds, searching for a voice that sounded like their own. That's why this moment mattered. It was never just Harris versus Crockett. It was rage versus composure, hierarchy versus authenticity, the institution versus the people. And when Crockett finally opened her mouth, her words didn't just answer Harris. They rewrote the script of the night. And as the crowd braced for fireworks, they had no idea just how explosive it was about to get. To understand why Kamala Harris's eruption hit with such force, you have to know the story behind her. Because Kamala wasn't always the one shouting. In fact, for most of her career, she built her reputation on being polished, calculated, and, at least on the surface, in control. Harris rose quickly in American politics, carving out a path first as a prosecutor, then as Attorney General of California, and eventually as a U.S. Senator. Her supporters saw her as a trailblazer, a woman breaking barriers in a world long dominated by men. But from the very beginning, her critics noticed something else: a sharp edge behind the polished smile, a tendency to snap when challenged, an instinct not to bend but to strike back hard. In debates, Harris could be ruthless. She knew how to press an opponent, how to land the zinger that would dominate the news cycle. Remember the 2019 Democratic primaries? One moment in particular still lingers in the collective memory. Harris, with steely poise, turned to Joe Biden and delivered a piercing line about his record on segregation and busing. It was the kind of takedown that instantly went viral, sending her surging in the polls overnight. For a brief moment, it seemed like Harris had the magic touch, the ability to turn confrontation into ascendancy. But that same sharpness that made her feared also made her vulnerable. Over the years, critics accused Harris of being inconsistent, even opportunistic. A prosecutor who touted tough-on-crime policies one decade, then pivoted toward progressive reforms the next. A candidate who could be fiery on stage, but often vague when pressed for specifics. And time again, when pushed into uncomfortable corners, Harris seemed to default to defensiveness. A laugh that sounded forced. A phrase that landed awkwardly. Or, in moments like the one on stage with Crockett, a flash of frustration that revealed just how thin the armor really was. What made this eruption sting wasn't just the volume of Harris's voice. It was the contradiction. Here was the Vice President of the United States, a figure meant to embody steadiness, leadership, and grace under pressure, breaking down in front of the cameras. For years, she had been coached to appear presidential, to project authority. Yet, in one unguarded outburst, all of that polish cracked. What came spilling out was raw emotion, anger, defensiveness, and perhaps even fear. It wasn't the first time. Journalists have long pointed to moments when Harris seemed rattled under scrutiny. A tense exchange with a reporter. An awkward laugh in response to serious questions. A defensive snap when confronted about her record. Each time, the pattern reinforced a growing perception. Behind the rehearsed lines, Kamala Harris could be thin-skinned. And in politics, thin skin is dangerous. On that stage, the image became unavoidable. Harris wasn't the cool, collected leader her team wanted the world to see. She was the embodiment of power lashing out when challenged. The establishment roaring, trying to silence a challenger through sheer force of will. That's why the moment mattered so much. It wasn't just Harris shouting. It was the vice president exposing a truth her critics had whispered for years, that behind the polish was a streak of arrogance, a refusal to be questioned, and a deep frustration with anyone who dared defy her. And as the cameras rolled, the contrast only sharpened. Harris leaning forward, her voice rising, her composure slipping. Crockett sitting still, her silence growing louder than any words could. For once, Harris wasn't the prosecutor in control of the courtroom. She was the defendant, unraveling under the pressure of her own fury. In the cinematic arc of politics, every villain has their moment of exposure, the instant when their flaws aren't just whispered in side conversations, but laid bare for the entire country to witness. For Kamala Harris, that moment came here, and as her outburst echoed across the chamber, what had once been hidden was now undeniable. the Vice President of the United States, rattled, defensive, and cracking under the weight of her own contradictions. But if Harris's outburst was a revelation of weakness, it also set the stage for something greater. Because her opponent on that night was not an ordinary politician, not someone easily bullied or silenced. Jasmine Crockett had her own story, a story forged not in comfort or privilege, but in battles that had tested her spirit again and again. And while Harris unleashed fury, Crockett was preparing to unleash something far more devastating. But Crockett was no ordinary opponent, and her past battles had already forged her steel. If Kamala Harris's story was one of power gained, polished, and fiercely defended, Jasmine Crockett's was the opposite. Hers was a story born in struggle, sharpened in sacrifice, and defined by the refusal to be silenced. Crockett didn't walk into politics with the backing of dynasties, the weight of institutions, or a ready-made path cleared for her. She clawed her way forward, often against odds that would have broken most. Before she ever set foot in Washington, she was a public defender, the kind of lawyer who doesn't chase prestige but stands in the trenches beside people who can't afford a voice of their own. Day after day, she went up against a system designed to grind people down. Day after day, she stared into the faces of clients who the world had written off, and she chose to fight for them anyway. That fight left scars, but it also built something far stronger: resilience. You don't survive those battles without learning how to keep your composure, even when everything around you is chaos. You don't stand in courtrooms, face judges and prosecutors stacked against you, and still find the courage to argue with clarity, unless you have steel running through your veins. That's who Crockett was, long before the cameras ever found her. When she stepped into politics, the odds didn't suddenly tilt in her favor. If anything, the battles only grew steeper. She was underestimated, dismissed, sometimes mocked. There were whispers that she was too blunt, too passionate, too unwilling to play the game. But that was exactly why ordinary people loved her. Because she didn't play the game. She spoke like she meant it. She carried herself like someone who had nothing to prove and everything to fight for. Her authenticity wasn't something crafted in a strategist's office. It was lived. It was rooted in the grit of her upbringing, the lessons of struggle, and the values that shaped her. While others polished their sound bites, Crockett spoke with the plain clarity of someone who refused to dress the truth in fancy packaging. And when voters heard her, they believed her. Not because she was perfect, but because she was real. That's what made her stand out on that stage. She didn't come cloaked in the trappings of establishment power. She didn't need to. Her authority came from somewhere deeper, from every person who had ever been dismissed, underestimated, or shouted over, and who saw in her a reflection of themselves. And so, when Kamala Harris's voice exploded, when the vice president tried to dominate with sheer volume, Crockett didn't rise to meet it with anger of her own. She didn't need to. Her composure wasn't weakness. It was strength. The same strength that had carried her through courtrooms stacked against her. The same strength that had carried her through campaigns where the odds said she shouldn't have stood a chance. The same strength that made her the kind of leader who didn't just talk about dignity, she embodied it. The audience felt it. You could see it in the way eyes lingered on her, in the way the silence she held became more powerful than the eruption aimed at her. People root for authenticity, they root for dignity, and in that moment Crockett became the living proof of both. What Harris didn't realize, what perhaps she couldn't realize, was that her eruption had given Crockett the perfect opening. Every ounce of frustration Harris unleashed only made Crockett's calm more striking. Every raised syllable from the vice president only made the silence of her opponent more deafening. Because Crockett wasn't just another politician in this moment. She was a symbol. A reminder that power isn't measured by how loudly you speak, but by how firmly you stand. That in politics, as in life, true strength is in the absence of struggle. It's the ability to remain unshaken through it. The internet was already waiting for a moment like this. Viewers had seen politicians shout. They'd seen leaders lose their temper. That was nothing new. What they hadn't seen, what they craved without even knowing it, was someone who could stand calm in the face of rage and still cut deeper with words that didn't need to be screamed. Crockett was about to give them that moment. And as the cameras closed in, as the room held its breath, as millions of viewers leaned closer to their screens, Crockett prepared to do what she had done her entire life: stand firm, speak clearly, and let the truth do the heavy lifting. And when Harris came for her, Crockett unleashed the reply of a lifetime. The silence after Kamala Harris's eruption didn't last long. She leaned forward, unwilling to let the quiet settle. Her voice rose again, sharper this time, like a blade seeking to cut through the calm presence across from her. You think you can stand there and question me? Do you understand what I've done, what I've carried for this country? Harris's words snapped through the air. Each sentence landed heavy, not as reasoned argument, but as a demand to be acknowledged. The crowd shifted uneasily. A few gasps broke the tension. Cameras zoomed tighter, locking in on every flicker of her expression. It was clear the vice president wasn't debating anymore. She was defending her pride. Crockett didn't move. Her hands still rested on the table, her shoulders relaxed, her eyes steady. No interruptions. No raised voice. Just silence. And somehow that silence was louder than Harris's fury. Harris pressed harder. Don't sit there pretending your experience compares to mine. Don't act like you can lecture me on service, on sacrifice. I have given decades to this fight. Her voice cracked at the edges. The intensity that was meant to project strength now revealed something else. Strain. Harris wasn't speaking for the audience anymore. She was speaking at Crockett, almost pleading to be recognized, to reassert dominance. The murmurs in the audience grew. Some whispered nervously, others shook their heads. It wasn't supposed to look like this. A vice president lashing out against someone who hadn't even raised her voice. The imbalance was striking. Still, Crockett sat unmoved. Her eyes met Harris's with calm focus, not aggression. Every moment she remained silent, every second she refused to rise to the bait, the tension mounted. Her composure became its own weapon, a quiet mirror reflecting Harris's unraveling. Harris tried again, doubling down. You will not disrespect me on this stage. You will not undermine what I have built. Do you hear me? The audience reaction was immediate, a mix of gasps and uncomfortable laughter. Harris wasn't asking a question anymore. She was demanding obedience. And the cameras caught it all. Every furrowed brow, every bead of sweat, every gesture that betrayed how rattled she had become. And yet Crockett still said nothing. Her silence, her patience, was now the center of gravity in the room. People weren't listening to Harris anymore. They were waiting for Crockett. Waiting to see what would finally break the stillness. The moderators shifted in their seats, unsure whether to intervene. The tension was that thick. Harris's words filled the air, but it was Crockett's calm that owned the moment. Finally, Harris slammed the table with her palm. Answer me. The chamber went dead quiet. You could hear the hum of the cameras. Every phone in the audience pointed forward, every eye locked on Crockett. The vice president had demanded submission in front of the nation. And yet Crockett did not flinch. Her eyes narrowed just slightly, her chin lifted, and in that silence you could feel the balance of power tilting. Harris had said too much. She had given away her composure. The room wasn't waiting for Harris anymore. It was waiting for Crockett. And when she finally spoke, it would not just be a response, it would be a reckoning. And then, in one perfectly timed breath, Crockett dropped the counter-strike. The air was tight enough to snap. Harris had been throwing jabs like a fighter desperate to end the round on top, her voice climbing higher, her hands cutting through the air as though slicing her opponent into pieces. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't recoil. She didn't even blink in panic. Instead, she let the storm crash around her, silent in the eye of it. And then, she drew breath. The pause alone was electric. Cameras zoomed in, microphones leaned forward. Harris, still breathing heavy from her own verbal barrage, stared at Crockett as though daring her to answer. But Crockett wasn't rattled. She was calculating. She was precise. And when she finally spoke, her voice cut cleaner than anything Harris had just thrown. You know, Madam Vice President, she began softly, almost disarmingly, when people lose their temper this way, it's usually because the truth has already cornered them. The audience shifted. A murmur rippled across the room. Harris blinked. A fraction of hesitation, a rare misstep. Crockett saw it and pressed forward, not with volume but with sharp, deliberate cadence. You've built a career on polished speeches, practiced smiles, and carefully crafted lines. But here, right now, we see the mask slip. And maybe the American people deserve to see what lies underneath. Gasps, then applause. Harris's jaw tightened, but she stayed silent, her shoulders inching upward with restrained fury. Crockett leaned in ever so slightly, her calmness weaponized. You talk about leadership as though it's performance, but leadership isn't screaming the loudest. Leadership is standing steady when others lose control. The crowd erupted again, and this time Harris couldn't hide the flicker of panic in her eyes. She shifted in her chair, crossed her arms, then uncrossed them, her body betraying the crack in her confidence. Crockett, sensing the blood in the water, didn't relent. She didn't speed up or gloat. She simply continued, her voice steady, each word landing like a measured strike. You tried to paint me as inexperienced, as unworthy of this stage. But here we are, and it isn't my voice shaking. It isn't my temper slipping. It isn't me shouting at another woman to prove my strength. Thunderous applause. Some even stood, clapping as Harris's face froze in the kind of smile politicians wear when every instinct tells them they've already lost the room. Harris opened her mouth, perhaps to cut in, but Crockett didn't let her. Because strength, she said firmly, isn't about wielding power to silence people. Strength is being willing to be challenged. Strength is listening even when it stings. A stunned silence followed, heavier than any applause. It was the silence of realization, the silence that comes when a narrative flips in real time. Harris had entered this exchange as the figure of authority, the vice president, the veteran. But now she looked defensive, exposed, shaken. Crockett had inverted the stage dynamic in under 2 minutes. And then came the line that would echo far beyond that room. I refuse to meet arrogance with arrogance. I refuse to shout because I don't need to. Madam Vice President, I don't need to be louder than you to be stronger than you. The room exploded. Applause, cheers, even whistles cut through the hall. The cameras panned across the audience, capturing faces lit with astonishment, admiration, disbelief. This wasn't just a rebuttal. This was a dismantling. And Harris, for all her experience, had no defense. Her body language betrayed her, the tightness around her mouth, the way she forced her posture taller, as though sheer physical height could reassert dominance. But the damage was done. The visual was permanent. Crockett sat back, serene, almost regal. She didn't chase the applause. She didn't ride the moment. She simply let it exist, knowing it spoke louder than any follow-up could. It was the kind of moment every debate coach dreams of, the perfectly timed counterstrike, where composure itself becomes the dagger. The audience wasn't just watching a debate anymore. They were witnessing a transfer of power. And Harris knew it. The crack in her armor was visible now. Her next attempt to speak came out stilted, her voice slightly thinner, her rhythm disrupted. Every twitch, every blink, every forced smile was captured by cameras, broadcast in real time, magnified by replay. Meanwhile, Crockett didn't need to say another word to win. Her poise was victory. Her silence between sentences was louder than Harris's shouting had ever been. Commentators would later describe it as the precise moment the debate flipped. Not when Harris erupted. Not when the room gasped. But when Jasmine Crockett, calm and unshaken, looked the vice president dead in the eye and delivered a response that will be replayed for years. It wasn't just politics. It was theater. It was power stripped bare. And as the applause lingered, one thought became clear to everyone in the room. The tide had turned. But beyond those walls, beyond the bright lights, the cameras, and the roar of the audience, the shockwaves were only just beginning. The words had barely left Jasmine Crockett's lips when the ripple began. At first, it was just the sound inside the hall, a roar of applause, cheers, even a few stunned gasps that had yet to settle. But within seconds, smartphones were out, cameras rolling, clips uploading. The moment was already breaking free of the walls where it happened. And once it hit the bloodstream of social media, there was no stopping it. On Twitter, or X, as some insist on calling it, the hashtags started climbing. #Crockett clapback, #Harris meltdown, #their reply. At first, they sat quietly in the trending bar, but within minutes they exploded upward, overtaking sports highlights, celebrity gossip, even a late-breaking international story. People weren't just talking about politics anymore, they were talking about the moment. One viral tweet read, "This isn't about parties or politics, it's about grace under fire." Crockett just gave a masterclass. Another chimed in. Kamala went for the jugular, but Crockett came with the soul. That was dignity, live on stage. TikTok stitched the exchange 1,000 different ways. Teenagers who normally avoided C-SPAN like the plague were lip-syncing Crockett's poised retort, turning it into a meme format. Some edited Harris's escalating frustration into a slow-motion montage with dramatic music, only to cut to Crockett's calm face at the exact beat drop. The comment sections filled with "she ate," "legend," and a flood of clapping hand emojis. Instagram Reels turned her into an icon almost overnight. Someone threw Crockett's final words onto a cinematic black and white edit with subtitles captioned, "How to win a debate without losing your soul." The clip racked up over 1 million views in under an hour. Then came the pundits. Across cable networks, anchors replayed the exchange on loop. On one channel, a commentator leaned back in his chair and chuckled, "Look, lover or hater, you can't deny, Crockett was unshakable. That's the kind of poise you can't coach." Another panel dissected Harris's body language frame by frame, noting the tightening jaw, the restless hand movements, the way her voice rose in pitch as Crockett stayed grounded. Even voices you wouldn't expect began chiming in. A conservative columnist tweeted, "I don't agree with her politics, but Crockett handled herself better than most people I've seen in that position. Respect where it's due." Meanwhile, progressive leaders hailed her as the future of resilience in politics. The rare overlap created something bigger than partisanship. It became cultural. Memes sprouted everywhere. One showed Harris shouting, captioned with "volume, 100%," followed by Crockett's calm reply captioned "impact, 1,000%. Another turned the exchange into a boxing metaphor, labeling Harris's escalating points as jabs and Crockett's final retort as the knockout punch. Podcasts recorded emergency episodes just to talk about it. Late-night hosts squeezed it into their monologues. One joked, "Usually politicians put people to sleep. Tonight, Crockett just woke everybody up." And for those who had been following Crockett's career, her uphill battles, her grit in the trenches of politics, this was vindication. "She's been underestimated for years," one op-ed declared. But when the spotlight hit, she didn't just survive. She defined the moment. The response wasn't just admiration. It was identification. People across the country, teachers, parents, workers, students, saw themselves in Crockett's calm dignity. They saw what it meant to hold composure in the face of aggression, to answer force with presence. It wasn't just a political win, it was a cultural lesson. And while Harris had walked off stage visibly rattled, her confidence punctured, Crockett left with something else entirely: momentum. The narrative was no longer about who shouted the loudest, but who stood tallest. Cable news chyrons screamed things like, "Crockett versus Harris, who really won?" But for most viewers, the answer was already decided. The clip was everywhere, and the consensus was clear: Harris lost control, Crockett gained history. By midnight, the clip had crossed oceans. British tabloids plastered the exchange on their homepages. Commentators in Australia and Canada debated it on morning shows. Hashtags trended in Spanish and French as translations of her reply circulated across the globe. This wasn't just a moment. It was a wave, and Crockett was at the center of it. And yet, the biggest question lingered. Beyond the memes, beyond the viral clips, beyond the hashtags racing through cyberspace, what did it mean? What was the lesson this clash left behind for Americans watching at home? The answer wasn't simple, but it mattered. And the story wasn't over yet. Cliffhanger, but what lasting lesson did this clash leave behind, and why does it matter to every American watching? The cameras stopped rolling. The applause faded. The hashtags would trend for hours, maybe days, and yet the true significance of that moment went far beyond viral clips or sound bites. Jasmine Crockett's victory on stage was not merely a personal triumph. It was a lesson, a demonstration of something far deeper, far more enduring. Dignity outlasts rage, composure defeats arrogance. In the immediate aftermath, it was easy to fixate on the spectacle. Harris had shouted. Crockett had responded. Millions had witnessed the exchange, replayed it, dissected it. But if you looked closer, if you listened beyond the applause and memes, the story told a more universal truth. Crockett's poise wasn't just a political strategy. It was a statement about character, about how we confront challenges, how we respond when power is wielded to intimidate. Across the room, across the nation, across every device where the video had gone viral, the lesson spread. People saw that anger, no matter how loud, could not rewrite reality. That forceful words, no matter how calculated, could not substitute for substance. And that calm, grounded presence, the kind that comes from integrity, resilience, and self-belief, had an impact far beyond the stage. It was a reminder that the qualities that truly endure are not the ones that draw immediate attention, but those that withstand scrutiny and time. Crockett's composure was not weakness. It was strength. Her refusal to be baited, her ability to remain steady when confronted with fury, her clarity of voice when chaos swirled around her, these were lessons for every viewer, whether they followed politics closely or watched from the sidelines. And the moral reverberated beyond one debate or one viral clip. It tied into core American values: justice, fairness, respect for others, and calm strength in the face of provocation. It reminded people that leadership isn't about domination or shouting to drown out dissent. It's about listening, standing firm, and embodying the principles you claim to uphold. Crockett's moment was a microcosm of that truth, a single exchange that illustrated what it truly means to lead with dignity. By the end of the night, the contrast was undeniable. Harris had let frustration dictate her behavior. She had shouted, gestured, tried to assert control through volume. Crockett had let none of that shake her. She had met fire with steadiness, aggression with grace, and the result was historic. In the minds of those watching, in living rooms, offices, classrooms, and scrolling feeds across the globe, the takeaway was simple yet profound. It wasn't just about who won the debate. It was about who embodied values worth following, lessons worth remembering. And in that moment, the truth was clear. Dignity, courage, and integrity leave marks that rage never can. As the echoes of the applause faded, one line summed it up. In the end, Harris shouted. Crockett stood tall, and the internet and history remembered who carried the truth. And if this moment proves anything, it's that voices like yours matter too. That in any challenge, in any confrontation, how you respond with courage, with composure, with dignity defines the narrative far more than the force of those trying to dominate you. This wasn't just a debate. It was a lesson. And the lesson was universal. Power is fleeting, but integrity is permanent. Anger might grab attention for a moment, but calm strength earns respect forever. Every viewer who watched that stage, every person who shared the clip, every commenter who expressed awe or admiration carried that lesson forward. And in doing so, they participated in something bigger than politics. They bore witness to the triumph of character over chaos, and they were reminded that the values we hold can indeed shape the world around us. And there it was, the moment the world couldn't stop talking about. Kamala Harris explodes on Jasmine Crockett, but her epic response didn't just break the internet, it lit a fire in millions. Millions of viewers across the globe watched as composure met chaos, dignity met aggression, and one voice rose above the noise. And now, it's your turn to be part of the conversation. Did you feel the tension? Did you see the shift in power on that stage? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear your take. Share this video with friends, family, anyone who needs a reminder that true strength isn't about volume, it's about integrity, poise, and unwavering courage. If you haven't already, hit subscribe. Turn on notifications so you never miss a moment of drama, revelation, and those unforgettable lessons that go beyond politics and into life itself. Every time you engage, every time you join the discussion, you're part of a movement, a collective that values dignity, clarity, and the courage to stand tall even when others try to shout you down. Because the truth of this moment isn't just for Crockett or Harris, it's for all of us. It's a reminder that we can rise above chaos, that our voices matter, and that integrity has a power no anger can match. So watch closely, reflect deeply, and remember, when dignity speaks louder than rage, the world has no choice but to listen.